The dealer's verdict came in 4 words: $200,000. 8 luxury vehicles, identical fault codes, one devastating estimate. Margaret Holloway had not signed. She called the man the dealer had fired 18 months earlier, the man who had submitted a technical bulletin about this exact problem, only to watch the director bury it and show him the door. Tonight, Ryan Cole stood alone in his small Chicago shop, one diagnostic meter in hand, a $14 fuse on the workbench. He had lost everything for knowing too much. Now he was about to prove exactly how much he knew. Stay with this story. What he found that night will change how you look at every single repair bill forever. The morning came in cold and gray over Chicago's Halsted Street, the kind of November cold that settled into concrete and brick and did not offer to leave until sometime in March. Ryan Cole had opened the shop at 6:45 the way he always did, unlocking the side door with the key that stuck on the third turn, flipping the overhead lights in sequence from front to back, running the wall heater up from its overnight setting, and waiting for the 3 minutes of groaning protest it delivered before committing to warmth. Cole Auto Repair occupied a narrow service bay wedged between a Vietnamese grocery and a dry cleaner on a block that saw more foot traffic than vehicle traffic, the kind of storefront most people passed without reading the sign. Inside, the tools along the left wall were organized with a deliberateness that seemed almost out of scale with the space. Every socket set in its rail, every torque wrench hung rather than set down, every diagnostic cable coiled rather than draped. The scan station beside the lift was newer than anything else in the building, purchased secondhand from a dealership closure 2 years prior. Updated with software licenses Ryan renewed each January regardless of how thin the margins ran. He had made that priority early on because he understood that credibility in a small shop came from what you pointed to, not from what you said about yourself. The equipment was the argument. Lucas Reed arrived at 7, pulling his jacket off in the doorway and dropping his bag beside the lift post. He was 26, trained at a vocational program and 2 years into a trade he was still growing into, reliable in the specific way some young mechanics are before the industry teaches them to cut corners. He asked questions when uncertain, admitted when he needed help, and did not pretend otherwise. In the small waiting area off the front of the shop, separated from the bay by a half wall of glass, Ryan's daughter Grace had fallen asleep in the corner chair with her school jacket pulled over her shoulder and her backpack wedged under her feet. School had closed for the snow, and the neighbor who sometimes helped on short notice was out of town. Ryan had covered Grace with a folded shop blanket without disturbing her. Neither he nor Lucas mentioned her again. The shop operated on a quiet understanding about the shape of Ryan's days, and on mornings like this one, that understanding was enough. The phone call came at 8:17. Margaret Holloway introduced herself without preamble. She was the founder of Morrison Capital Group, a private investment firm headquartered 3 miles north on Michigan Avenue, and she had a problem that had been growing for nearly 3 weeks. She owned 8 Bentley Bentayga speed vehicles, maintained under a comprehensive service agreement and used exclusively to transport senior clients and private partners to meetings, airports, and engagements that required reliability and a certain kind of discretion. All 8 had been brought to Vance Prestige Auto Group on the same service visit in mid-November for standard scheduled maintenance. All 8 had returned with clean paperwork, and all 8 had begun displaying critical fault codes within 14 days of being returned to her fleet. She had received a formal service estimate that morning, $200,000 to repair the fleet, $25,000 per vehicle, covering a complete replacement of each car's central advanced driver assistance system control module plus full system recalibration and road verification testing. The estimate was detailed, professionally formatted, and delivered with the quiet authority of an institution that expected no further questions. She had not signed it. Something about the arithmetic of the situation, 8 vehicles, the same fault presentation, the same proposed repair, the same unit cost, all emerging within the same 2-week window after the same service appointment, had held her pen still. In her experience, coincidences with that kind of perfect symmetry tended not to be coincidences. Ryan listened without interruption. When she finished, he asked 2 questions. What exactly were the fault codes, and had the cars been driven regularly in cold conditions since returning from service? She read from the estimate sheet 14 separate codes per vehicle, all grouped in the advanced driver assistance category, covering the camera array, the forward and rear radar sensors, the electronic stability control processor, and the emergency braking module. He asked her to describe how the fault screen had appeared when the codes first came on. She said they had all appeared simultaneously, all 14 at once, as if a single switch had been thrown rather than a chain of individual failures occurring in sequence. Ryan was quiet for a longer interval than she had expected from someone who had just been handed a business inquiry. He told her he would take the case. He did not tell her that the silence had been him recognizing something he had documented 2 years earlier and watched get buried before it could help anyone. He had spent 4 years at Vance Prestige. First as a senior technician on European marques, eventually as the lead diagnostics specialist for Bentley, Porsche, and McLaren platforms across the dealer group's primary facility. In September of 2022, while investigating 2 Bentayga vehicles already in the shop showing unusual driver assistance behavior and cold starts, he had pulled a factory technical bulletin from Bentley Motors North America. The bulletin, designated TB 2023-441, identified a documented failure pattern in the Bentayga's auxiliary power distribution system, thermal fuse F47, a component that cost $14 and was located in a secondary junction box beneath the rear cargo floor panel, could degrade in cold climate use in a way that was electrically invisible at ambient temperature and only detectable under sustained thermal load. When the vehicle engine reached full operating temperature, the fuse's internal resistance would shift upward, producing a voltage drop across the shared power rail that supplied the entire advanced driver assistance system. Not a catastrophic loss of power, not enough to trigger a hard system shutdown, but enough to push every sensor and processor on that rail simultaneously into fault reporting mode. The bulletin explicitly recommended inspecting and replacing F47 before any module-level diagnostic or replacement work on any affected vehicle in the specified model year range. Ryan had compiled his findings on the 2 shop vehicles, documented the failure signature with voltage logs and thermal data, attached the bulletin, and submitted the full package to his department director with a written recommendation to add F47 to the cold climate service checklist for every Bentayga variant in the affected window. The director's name was Jason Mercer, and his reply had arrived within 48 hours. Not applicable to current inventory, do not escalate. 3 months after that, Ryan Cole had been terminated from Vance Prestige Auto Group. His personnel file cited a lack of team cohesion. He had printed both emails on the afternoon before his last day and put them in a manila folder in the back of his filing cabinet, not because he had a specific plan for them, but because there are things a person should keep a record of even when no one else seems interested in what occurred. He had not opened the folder since. The 18 months between that filing cabinet and this phone call had been the kind of months that do not announce themselves as difficult. They accumulate quietly, in the gap between what a person expected and what actually arrived. He had opened the shop with savings that were not quite enough and credit that was sufficient if he was careful. He had built the client base 1 referral at a time, on work performed correctly the first time, and explained honestly regardless of what the explanation cost him. He had taken on every vehicle that came through the door and turned none away because he could not afford to. There were evenings when he sat at that same workbench after Grace was asleep and worked through estimates for jobs that paid him $40 less than his labor was worth, because a $40 shortfall was better than an empty lift. He did not talk about any of this with Lucas. He did not talk about it with anyone. The folder stayed in the cabinet. The emails stayed in the folder. And Ryan Cole had spent a year and a half becoming very good at a business that required him to be right about things that other, larger businesses had concluded it was more profitable to misdiagnose. Margaret arranged for the first vehicle to be delivered before noon. It arrived on a flatbed, a silver Bentayga with 31,000 miles and a recently serviced engine bay, every maintenance sticker current, the body without a scratch. The moment Lucas turned the ignition, the dashboard loaded 14 warnings in a dense red cluster across the instrument display. Ryan connected the scan tool to the OBD port and let the system run its full read cycle before pulling results. 14 active codes across the screen, all residing in the same system family. Camera obstruction fault, radar module unresponsive, electronic stability program intervention error, autonomous emergency braking disabled, lane departure warning offline, and 9 more entries that were all variations on the same underlying failure condition. Not one code touched the engine management system, the transmission, the suspension hardware, or the brake hydraulics. The car's mechanical systems were entirely unremarkable. There were no impact marks on the sensor housings, no condensation visible behind the camera glass, no signs of physical damage to anything. Nothing had failed in any way that was physically visible. Lucas pulled a stool alongside and looked at the code list. He said multi-system ADAS faults at this scale typically pointed toward a gateway module failure, a shorted communication bus, or significant moisture intrusion, any of which could cascade errors across the network. Ryan shook his head and said, "Look at which specific systems are affected. Every one of them draws from the same 6th-degree power distribution rail. The pattern here is not a communication failure, and it is not random component degradation. The modules are all reporting correctly. They are reporting accurately that the power they are receiving is outside the tolerance they need to function. The components are not broken. The voltage feeding them is wrong." He picked up his multimeter and moved to the rear of the vehicle. He worked through the junction panels in order, starting with the primary distribution box under the hood and moving to the auxiliary panel mounted beneath the rear cargo floor. At 51 degrees Fahrenheit ambient, the unheated bay was cold but dry. The voltage at F47 read 12.4 volts, stable within specification. He started the engine, let it idle, and attached a thermocouple probe to the fuse housing. He watched both displays while the engine cycled toward operating temperature. At 160 degrees Fahrenheit, the voltage was 12.3. At 175, it dropped to 12.1. At 182 degrees, it settled at 11.7 and held, 0.3 volts below the lower edge of the specified band. Lucas looked over his shoulder at the multimeter and said that was a small number. Ryan said on most vehicles it was irrelevant. On the Bentega's advanced driver assistance platform, it represented the edge of the processor's confidence threshold. The system required voltage within a defined tolerance to maintain calibrated signal trust across every component on the shared rail. And below that edge, the central processor defaulted to simultaneous fault state across all downstream sensors and modules, not because the hardware had failed, but because the processor had lost confidence in the reliability of the power supply delivering information to it. Every one of those 14 warnings was the system saying it could no longer trust its own inputs, not because its eyes were broken, but because the electrical current behind them was no longer steady. He pulled a 47 with a fuse puller and held it under the bench light, turning it slowly. The bridge wire inside the housing appeared visually intact. The casing showed no discoloration or physical deformation. That was the nature of thermal fuse degradation. It did not announce itself by blowing. It accumulated resistance with repeated heat cycles, tested clean at ambient conditions, and degraded only when it mattered, under load, at temperature, invisibly and silently corrupting everything downstream. He ordered the replacement from the parts shelf, $14, F47, original equipment specification, and installed it in under 5 minutes. He cleared the stored codes, restarted the engine, and monitored the auxiliary rail voltage as the engine cycled back to operating temperature. At 182 degrees housing temperature, the reading held at 12.4 volts, steady throughout. He connected the scan tool, 0 active faults, 0 stored faults. He took the car out alone and drove 12 miles through the neighborhood, stop-and-go blocks, a section of arterial road, a stretch of highway to engage the adaptive systems at speed, returned, scanned, clean. He drove 11 miles in the other direction, still clean. He logged the voltage measurements at each stage, the scan outputs from each test, photographs of the original fuse alongside the replacement, and the odometer readings at each interval. He noted the ambient air temperature at each test drive start, the housing temperature at the point of measurement, the precise time elapsed between engine start and the voltage reading, and the road and traffic conditions encountered during each interval. The documentation was the kind that left no interpretive space, the kind that answered the follow-up questions before they could be formed. Then he called Margaret Holloway and told her exactly what he had found, exactly what he had repaired, and exactly what it had cost. Carter Winslow was on speaker in her office. When Ryan finished, Winslow said what he needed to say. A Bentley-certified facility with a full technical staff had assessed these same vehicles and produced a conclusion requiring $200,000 in parts. He wanted to understand how a different result was possible. Ryan said the question was fair. He said he was not able to say with certainty whether the fault had been overlooked through negligence or avoided through intention, but he said that the distinction between those two possibilities was precisely what Margaret should be asking the facility to answer in writing. Ryan sent the 12-page diagnostic report to Margaret's email before 4 o'clock, attaching the voltage logs, the thermal data, the scan tool records, the pre- and post-comparison screens, the test drive mileage documentation, and his written summary. He recommended she forward the report to Vance Prestige with a formal written request for a line-by-line account of their diagnostic process and an explanation of how a $25,000 module replacement had been recommended per vehicle when the root cause was a $14 fuse explicitly identified in a manufacturer bulletin. Margaret sent the report to Isabella Vance's direct business email that same afternoon, with a subject line that was 2 sentences and not possible to misread. Isabella received the email at 4:47. She opened the attachment, read for approximately 90 seconds, and forwarded the file to Jason Mercer with a single line. "Handle this and get back to me by end of day." She had 17 other unread messages, a board presentation in 31 hours, and a shareholder call beginning in 20 minutes. She did not read page 3, which contained the voltage log. She did not read page 9, which contained Ryan Cole's name in the diagnostician field. Jason Mercer read page 9 first. He had recognized the diagnostic structure before he even reached the name, the voltage measurement sequence, the thermal profiling methodology, the specific framing of the fault as a power supply degradation rather than a component failure. He had worked alongside Ryan Cole for 4 years. He sat at his desk without picking up the phone for 11 minutes. Then he called Margaret Holloway. He spoke for 22 minutes, his voice measured and professionally patient throughout. He explained that a fuse replacement might suppress the codes on the surface, but that the sustained voltage irregularity had already introduced what he described as latent degradation to the module's internal solid-state components. Damage that did not appear on standard diagnostic scans in the short term, but that would produce unpredictable and potentially dangerous system failures under operating conditions within months. He said the technician who had performed the work held no Bentley certification and had no authorization to access covered electronic systems, that allowing an uncertified party to intervene in the vehicle's electronics had technically voided that vehicle's manufacturer warranty. He said the remaining 7 cars had not been touched, and he strongly recommended they be returned to Vance Prestige immediately, because the combined remaining warranty value across those 7 vehicles was approximately $1.4 million, and he would not be able to protect it if a non-certified party interacted with their systems. Carter Winslow called Ryan at 6:15 that evening and said Morrison Capital was reconsidering its position. The warranty exposure was a number the company could not carry on the strength of an independent opinion. Ryan asked for 48 hours. Winslow agreed with the measured tone of a man doing a favor he was not certain he should extend. 40 minutes after that call, Isabella Vance called Cole Auto directly. Ryan answered. She did not recognize his name. She had been appointed CEO 14 months earlier after her father's death, and Ryan had been gone for 18 months before that, leaving no period of overlap. She informed him that his intervention with Morrison Capital's vehicles constituted interference with active service contracts and that Vance Prestige's legal team was prepared to seek injunctive relief. Ryan told her she was welcome to pursue that course. He told her he thought she should read the report carefully before instructing counsel to file anything. She said she had reviewed the material. He said, "Page 3 of that report contains a voltage log that identifies the exact failure mechanism. Page 9 contains the name of the person who submitted a formal technical bulletin about this precise failure pattern to your service director in September of 2022, and the name of the director who reviewed that bulletin, marked it not applicable, and elected not to escalate it." He said, "I think those 2 pages are worth your time before you make any other decision." She ended the call without a response. The formal warranty notice arrived at Morrison Capital the following morning, 4 pages from Vance Prestige's legal department, citing contract language, warranty codes, and a paragraph stating that unauthorized electronic access by non-certified technicians constituted an irreversible voiding event under the terms of the manufacturer extended service agreement. At the same time, Jason Mercer submitted a license compliance inquiry to the Illinois Regulatory Authority regarding Cole Auto Repair, listing 3 questions related to manufacturer-specific electronic diagnostic access and suggesting a formal review was warranted. Carter Winslow called Ryan at 9. He said what he had called to say. The board had fiduciary obligations, and a $1.4 million warranty exposure was not an amount any responsible company could dismiss on the basis of a 14-page independent diagnostic report, however compelling. Unless Ryan could provide documentation that resolved the liability question, Morrison Capital would accept Vance Prestige's terms by Thursday morning. Ryan asked for 48 hours. Winslow said Thursday was the limit. Ryan spent an hour after that call sitting at the workbench without working. He was not someone who spent much time on the emotional register of situations. He had learned, in the years since Diane died and the years since Vance Prestige, to move through difficulty rather than around it, to keep his hands on the problem until the problem was resolved. But this specific situation had a weight to it that was different from the standard kind of difficulty, because it was not simply professional. He had submitted a bulletin 18 months ago, and Jason had buried it. And somewhere in those 18 months, an unknown number of vehicle owners had paid $25,000 apiece for a repair they did not need, and the company that should have known better had instead employed its resources to construct the appearance of having been correct all along. He was not angry in the way anger normally works, loud, urgent, directed outward. What he felt was more deliberate than that, the specific clarity of a person who has watched a wrong go unaddressed long enough to understand precisely what correcting it will require. He pulled the folder out of the cabinet and got to work. The first was establishing that Jason Mercer had known about the F-47 failure pattern before any of the Morrison Capital vehicles had arrived for their service appointment. Not that he had missed the bulletin, but that he had received it, reviewed it, and actively suppressed it. He did not need to find anything new to establish this. The manila folder had been in the filing cabinet for 18 months. He pulled it out at 10:45 that night and looked at both documents under the bench light. The email he had sent on the 14th of September 2022, with the bulletin attached and the subject line requesting urgent review, and Jason's reply dated 2 days later, 9 words, not applicable to current inventory, do not escalate. He photographed both pages, forwarded them to his personal email, and saved copies in 3 separate locations. The second problem was obtaining independent written confirmation that the module in the first repaired vehicle remained undamaged, and that the fuse replacement performed in accordance with the manufacturer bulletin did not qualify as unauthorized modification under any applicable warranty language. He called a senior engineer at Bentley Motors North America named Daniel Whitfield, who had been involved in developing the original bulletin and who confirmed both points in a call that lasted 14 minutes and ended with a promise to have a signed letter in Ryan's email within the hour. Lucas had spent the evening working through NH Public Records and identified 11 documented nationwide cases. Bentayga 2022 and 2023 vehicles with ADAS failures addressed by module replacement at authorized dealers, 3 of them at Vance Prestige, not one of the 11 showing any record of F-47 inspection before the module was ordered. By midnight, Ryan had assembled everything he needed into a sequence that could not be disassembled by authority or by confidence, or by 42 pages of bound technical presentation. Margaret Holloway had arranged the meeting and been explicit. Both parties in the same room, both making their case directly to her and Carter Winslow, no parallel legal channel managing the narrative. Jason Mercer arrived at 11 with an attorney and a bound 42-page technical presentation he placed at the head of the table. He was composed, well-dressed, and entirely at home, the conference room, the formal documentation, the institutional weight of an established dealer group behind him. This was familiar ground. Ryan Cole arrived alone. He set his laptop on the table, placed a padded envelope beside it, and set the removed 47 fuse in a small clear bag at the center of the surface between them. He did not explain what it was. He did not introduce himself to Jason. Jason looked at the bag and then at Margaret without acknowledging Ryan. Jason presented first. His 42 pages covered the Bentayga's driver assistance architecture with the depth of someone who had prepared carefully. The voltage tolerance windows for each sensor category, the known failure modes of solid-state modules subjected to substandard power supply, a concept he called latent degradation, in which microscopic stress damage accumulated in integrated circuits exposed to voltage irregularity without producing measurable faults in the short term, and 2 citations from automotive engineering publications. He concluded that Ryan's fuse replacement had addressed a surface indicator while leaving the underlying damage untreated. His attorney was quiet throughout but present in the way attorneys are at these meetings, visible, available, and carrying the implicit weight of what follows if the conversation does not resolve. Ryan waited for the silence to settle fully before he moved. He picked up the clear bag, placed it at the center of the table, looked at Jason Mercer, and asked one question. The module in the first repaired vehicle had been scanned 4 times across 340 miles of road testing at full operating temperature, and returned 0 fault codes on every reading. Was there anyone in this room prepared to state in writing that the module had been damaged? Nobody answered. Jason looked at the bag and not at Ryan. The attorney shifted slightly in his chair. Ryan opened the laptop and turned it toward the room. He presented 4 items. The voltage log. A 90-minute recording of the auxiliary power rail through cold start and full warm-up. The degradation signature at F47's housing temperature visible in the graph. The baseline restored cleanly after replacement. The scan tool record. The fault screen with 14 codes, followed immediately by the clean screen after the repair, followed by logged outputs from 5 separate test drives. The written confirmation from Daniel Whitfield at Bentley Motors North America. The bulletin was an official manufacturer advisory and fuse replacement performed in accordance with it did not constitute unauthorized modification under any applicable warranty clause. The mileage log, 340 miles of documented operation across a range of temperatures, clean scan outputs attached for each interval. Jason allowed a pause before he responded. He said the bulletin had been a discretionary advisory, not a mandatory protocol. He said Vance Prestige's technical staff had assessed its applicability and found it outside the parameters of the vehicles in question. He said this with the practiced authority of a man who had managed technical objections professionally for a long time. Then Ryan opened the padded envelope and placed 2 sheets of paper on the table. The first was his email to Jason Mercer dated the 14th of September 2022, with the bulletin attached, the subject line reading 47 thermal failure pattern on 2022 Bentayga, urgent review recommended. The second was Jason's reply dated the 16th of September, not applicable to current inventory, do not escalate. The 2 pages lay flat under the fluorescent ceiling light, and no one in the room spoke for close to 6 seconds. Isabella Vance had been sitting at the far end of the table with a legal pad she had not written on for the last 40 minutes. She looked at the 2 emails. Then she looked at Jason. The expression she carried was not anger. It was the stillness of a person running a rapid and unwelcome recalculation, adjusting what they thought they knew against a piece of evidence that did not accommodate the earlier version. She had not known these emails existed. She had been given an organization and trusted the people who ran its pieces before she arrived. 2 sheets of paper were now defining the dimensions of that trust with a precision she could not argue away. Jason's attorney raised the issue of confidentiality. Ryan was no longer employed, and internal correspondence was proprietary company material. Ryan said he had printed both documents during his employment as the author of one of them and had kept them in his own files. The attorney noted the company reserved its rights. The meeting closed without a formal resolution. Carter Winslow walked Jason and his attorney to the elevator. When the doors closed, the room held 3 people. Isabella gathered her legal pad and her unopened folder and left without speaking to either of the 2 who remained. She sat in her office at 11:40 that night, the building quiet around her, reviewing the Morrison Capital Fleet service records on the CEO-level portal she rarely used directly because the service division reported to her through Jason's summaries. She was reading raw data for the first time. The pattern Margaret had described was clear in the records. All 8 vehicles within a 4-day intake window, all returned within 48 hours, all generating fault codes within the following 2 weeks, gradually, as thermal cycles accumulated across the fuse housing exactly as the bulletin had predicted. What stopped her was a single entry in the procurement database. Jason Mercer had submitted a purchase order for 8 Bentley Bentayga ADAS control modules dated the 1st of November. The vehicles had arrived for service on the 14th of November. He had ordered the replacement modules 13 days before any of the 8 cars had been examined, diagnosed, or authorized for any repair work. A procurement entry at that value required a vehicle identification number and a documented diagnostic justification. The entry showed the fleet account number and a category designation of projected service recommendation, a classification designed for routine consumable items, not for $25,000 electronic assemblies that required individual vehicle-specific justification. She opened the technical bulletin database. TB 2023-441 was filed under the Bentayga service category marked not applicable, initial JM dated the 12th of September 2022. She pulled the entry's modification history. The bulletin had been received from Bentley Motors North America on the 8th of September 2022. 6 days before Ryan Cole had emailed it to Jason, meaning Jason had received the manufacturer's official distribution version, reviewed it, marked it inapplicable, and initialed the suppression before Ryan's internal submission ever arrived. He had not failed to act on Ryan's report. He had already acted on the source document first. She sat with that fact in the empty office for a long time. She drove to Cole Auto the following morning at 7:15 without calling ahead. The lights were already on inside. Ryan was beneath the rear of a truck when she stepped through the side door, and he rolled out when he heard her, looked at her from the floor for a moment, and stood without surprise or ceremony. She asked to see the repaired vehicle. He washed his hands at the utility sink and led her out to the back lot. The Bentayga was under a single light pole in the cold morning air. He started the engine and connected the scan tool with the cable from his shirt pocket. They stood together while the system initialized, neither of them speaking. The screen returned empty, 0 active codes, 0 stored codes. She looked at the display for longer than the reading required. She asked how many years he had worked at Vance Prestige. He said 4. She asked why he had left. He said he had been terminated in May of 2023. She asked what reason had been given on record. He said, lack of team cohesion. She did not respond to that. She looked at the empty screen once more and then walked back to her car. The board meeting was that afternoon at 2. Isabella presented the procurement order dated 2 weeks before the vehicle intake, the bulletin record dated and initialed by the service director before the model had seen its first Chicago winter, and the NHTSA complaint data Lucas had compiled, showing the same fault presentation at authorized dealerships across the country, and 3 cases at Vance Prestige specifically, all without any record of F-47 being checked before module work was performed. She did not editorialize. She set the documents in chronological order and let the sequence speak. The board authorized an internal investigation and suspended Jason Mercer pending its outcome by unanimous vote. He was escorted out of the building at 4:17 that afternoon, his access credentials deactivated before he reached the exit. The investigation that followed covered 11 weeks and nearly 3 years of service records and identified 47 instances of module-level replacements billed at full price on vehicles where fuse or relay-level intervention had been the available and undocumented solution. The findings were forwarded to Bentley Motors North America's Warranty Compliance Division and to the Illinois Consumer Protection Bureau. Isabella called Ryan at 6 that evening. He was still at the shop. She said, I owe you an apology for 3 things. First, I threatened you with legal action before I had read your documentation, and that was wrong. Second, I allowed the way my own company was structured to prevent me from seeing what I should have seen well before this week arrived. Third, and I want to be clear that this has nothing to do with the legal resolution, I now understand that what happened to you in May of 2023 was unjust, and I understand it fully. I cannot change it. But I want you to know that I am not unaware of it. Ryan said he appreciated her saying so. A pause opened on the line. He did not fill it. She did not fill it. Sometimes 3 honest sentences, offered plainly, are exactly the right length for what needs to be said. Vance Prestige repaired all 8 Morrison Capital vehicles within the following week. Each received a new F-47 fuse installed and verified at operating temperature before the vehicle was cleared. No module was replaced in any of the 8. The combined parts cost across the fleet was $112. Morrison Capital was charged nothing. The repairs were completed at Vance Prestige's expense under the terms of a written settlement that acknowledged the diagnostic error and released all outstanding warranty claims. Margaret Holloway accepted the keys on a Thursday afternoon and did not ask for anything beyond what had been agreed. Isabella restructured the service division in the weeks that followed. Any repair estimate exceeding $5,000 on an in-warranty vehicle now required independent review by a second technician not affiliated with the initial assessment. All manufacturer technical bulletins were reclassified from discretionary advisory to mandatory review, with written justification required before any bulletin could be marked inapplicable. The service director role was posted externally. The operational updates took effect without announcement and without ceremony, which was, in its own way, a kind of statement. The 47 cases identified in the internal investigation were more than a compliance matter. Each represented a vehicle owner who had paid for a repair they had not needed, on the authority of a diagnosis that had been guided not by the condition of the vehicle but by the presence of a parts order already filed. Bentley Motors North America's Warranty Division opened a formal review that extended to 4 other authorized dealer groups in the region. 2 of those groups subsequently identified similar patterns in their own historical service records. The Consumer Protection Bureau's findings were not publicized in detail, But the restitution process that followed cost Vance Prestige considerably more than the original $200,000 estimate that had started the entire sequence. 2 weeks after the case closed, Margaret Holloway called Ryan and offered Cole Auto the Morrison Capital Fleet maintenance contract, 12 vehicles over 1 year, with a renewal option. The value of the agreement was enough to add a second lift by February and bring on a full-time technician before spring. Lucas Reed signed a full-time offer letter the same afternoon Ryan signed the contract. Neither of them made anything of the moment beyond the paperwork involved. The shop changed in gradual, practical ways over the next month. A second diagnostic station took its place along the left wall. The waiting area got a proper coffee machine. A framed printout of the Enchitsa complaint summary sat on the shelf above Ryan's workbench. Unlabeled, unexplained, simply there, the way certain documents stay close to a person not because they need to consult them constantly, but because they represent something they chose not to surrender when surrendering it would have been the easier thing to do. On the last Friday of November, the sky over Halsted Street was pale and still, the kind of afternoon that arrives without weather after a long stretch of hard weeks and asks nothing of the people moving through it. Ryan was at his desk finishing the invoice on a brake job when the side door opened and Grace came in, pulling her backpack by one strap with her other hand holding a drawing folded in thirds, which she placed on the edge of his desk and then did not refer to again. She crossed to her chair in the waiting area and opened her homework folder with the calm of a child who had spent considerable time in a working space and understood its rhythms. Ryan unfolded the drawing under the bench light. It was a building with 2 windows, a bay door, and a sign above the entrance, careful, approximate letters. He folded it along its original creases and set it on the shelf above the Enchitsa printout. Then he returned to the invoice in front of him and finished it. The line item at the top of the Morrison receipt, the first repaired vehicle, read $14 and no cents. He signed it and filed it with the rest. There are people who are removed from rooms because they ask questions the room has decided are not needed. And there are the answers to those questions, sitting in junction boxes, in manila folders, in $14 fuses with hairline resistance drift that no one can see until someone decides to look for it. Waiting with the specific patience of things that are simply quietly factually true regardless of who decides not to acknowledge them. The dealer had said $200,000. The problem had cost $14,000. The distance between those two numbers was not a diagnostic failure. It was a decision made in ordinary daylight by a person who had calculated correctly that most people would not ask. The trouble with that kind of calculation is that it holds only until the one person who will ask comes along, and that person is almost always quieter than anyone expects.